The dusty streets of Millbrook Falls had seen their share of cruel words, but nothing quite like what happened that scorching Tuesday evening when Jake Callahan decided to make sport of the strange girl with the scarred hands. What he didn't know was that before the clock struck midnight, those same hands he mocked would become the only thing standing between his prize stallion and death itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late August sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden sidewalks of Millbrook Falls, Texas, turning the air thick and heavy like molasses. Dust devils danced between the weathered buildings that lined Main Street, where the scent of horse sweat and leather mingled with the aroma of fresh bread from Martha's bakery. It was the kind of day that made tempers flare and patience run thin, especially for a man like Jake Callahan. Jake spat into the dirt as he adjusted his black Stetson, the silver conchos on his belt catching the harsh sunlight. At 28, he commanded respect wherever he went, not through kindness, but through the sheer force of his reputation. His family owned the largest ranch for 3 counties, and Jake never let anyone forget it. The Callahan name carried weight in these parts, weight that Jake wielded like a weapon whenever it suited his purposes. He leaned against the hitching post outside Morrison's General Store, his steel-gray eyes scanning the street with the predatory gaze of a man who viewed the world as his personal domain. His boots, custom-made from the finest leather money could buy, bore the scuffs and dust of a working cowboy, though Jake did precious little actual work these days. That's what hired hands were for. "Afternoon, Mr. Callahan," called out Henry Morrison from the store's doorway, his voice carrying the careful deference that most townsfolk used when addressing the Callahan heir. "Your order's ready whenever you want to collect it." Jake nodded curtly, his attention already drifting elsewhere. The late afternoon crowd was beginning to thin as people sought shelter from the oppressive heat, but movement at the far end of the street caught his eye. A slight figure was making her way toward the center of town, moving with the careful, measured steps of someone trying not to draw attention. Elena Vasquez kept her hands tucked deep in the pockets of her faded blue dress, her dark hair braided and pinned back in a style that seemed decades out of fashion. She was 19, though the weight of her circumstances often made her seem older. Her olive complexion bore the telltale signs of long hours spent outdoors, and her clothes, while clean and carefully mended, spoke of a family that counted every penny. Jake's lips curved into a cruel smile as he recognized her. The Vasquez girl, the one with the strange reputation and even stranger hands. He'd heard the whispered rumors, seen the way people crossed themselves when she passed by. Some called her blessed, others cursed, but Jake called her an easy target. Elena approached the general store with obvious reluctance, her eyes downcast as she climbed the 3 wooden steps to the covered porch. She needed supplies for her family's small homestead on the outskirts of town, but venturing into the heart of Millbrook Falls always filled her with dread. People stared, whispered, made assumptions about things they couldn't possibly understand. Well, Jake's voice cut through the evening air like a rusty blade. "Look what the wind blew into town." Elena's shoulders tensed, but she didn't look up. She'd learned long ago that acknowledging Jake Callahan's attention only made things worse. Instead, she tried to slip past him into the store, but Jake stepped sideways, blocking her path with deliberate slowness. "Now that ain't very neighborly," Jake drawled, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the handful of people still on the street. "Did your mama teach you manners, girl?" A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the promise of entertainment. In a town where excitement was scarce, Jake Callahan's confrontations were considered prime amusement. Elena felt the familiar heat of shame creep up her neck as faces turned toward her, some curious, others already wearing expressions of anticipated cruelty. "I just need to buy some flour," Elena said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please let me pass." Jake threw back his head and laughed, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "How she speaks, and so polite, too." He circled her slowly like a vulture sizing up roadkill. "Tell me, Elena, that is your name, ain't it?" What exactly do you do with those hands of yours when you're not hiding them away like some shameful secret? The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Elena's breathing became shallow, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Her hands, still buried deep in her pockets, began to tremble slightly. "Come on now," Jake continued, his voice taking on a mocking sing-song quality. "Don't be shy. We're all friends here." He reached out suddenly, grasping her wrist before she could pull away. "Let's have a look at what you're so desperate to hide." "No, please," Eleanor gasped, trying to wrench her arm free, but Jake's grip was iron strong. With a violent yank, he pulled her hand from her pocket, exposing it to the harsh light and hungry stares of the assembled crowd. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers as they saw what Elena had spent years trying to conceal. Her hands were a roadmap of old scars, thin white lines that crisscrossed her palms and fingers like an intricate web. Some scars were perfectly straight, others curved and twisted, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their complexity. The skin was rough and weathered, bearing the calluses of hard work. But it was the scars that captured everyone's attention. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake said, his voice dripping with theatrical amazement. "Looks like somebody got a little too close to a hay baler." The crowd chuckled nervously, uncertain whether to be horrified or amused. Elena's face burned with humiliation as Jake held her hand aloft like a trophy. "Or maybe she tangled with a wildcat," he continued, warming to his audience. "Though I reckon any self-respecting cat would have better sense than to mess with something this ugly." The laughter that followed was sparse and uncomfortable, but Jake seemed energized by it. He turned Elena's hand this way and that, examining the scars with exaggerated fascination. "You know, I've seen some sorry sights in my time, but this here might just take the prize." "How'd you manage it, girl? Stick your hands in a threshing machine for fun?" Elena's free hand clenched into a fist at her side, but she remained silent. Years of similar encounters had taught her that fighting back only made the torment last longer. Better to endure in silence and hope Jake would grow bored quickly, but Jake was just getting started. "I bet you can't even hold a rope properly with hands like that," he said, adjusting his grip to display the scars more prominently. "Probably can't do much of anything useful, come to think of it. No wonder your family's scraping by on that pitiful patch of dirt you call a farm." The comment about her family struck home like a physical blow. Elena's dark eyes flashed with sudden fire, and she jerked her hand free with surprising strength. "My family works harder than you ever have," she said, her voice still quiet but carrying a steel edge that hadn't been there before. Jake's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Oh ho, the little mouse has claws after all." He stepped closer, using his considerable height advantage to loom over her. "Careful now, girl. You're talking to your betters." "Better at what?" Elena shot back, her composure finally cracking. "Better at living off your father's money? Better at bullying people who can't fight back? Better at pretending your worth comes from anything other than the luck of being born with the right last name?" The crowd fell silent, shocked by the sudden reversal. Jake's face darkened like a thundercloud, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. In all his years of tormenting the less fortunate, no one had ever dared speak to him with such defiance. "You've got a smart mouth for someone whose hands look like they went through a meat grinder," Jake snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Maybe I should teach you some respect." Elena took an involuntary step backward, suddenly aware that she'd pushed too far. Jake's reputation for violence was well earned, and she'd just humiliated him in front of half the town. The crowd seemed to sense the shift in mood, some of them backing away as the confrontation took on a darker tone. But before Jake could make good on his implied threat, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned to see Thomas Callahan, Jake's father, riding up Main Street on his magnificent black gelding. The elder Callahan was a man who commanded respect through presence alone, tall and broad-shouldered like his son, but carrying himself with a dignity that Jake had never quite mastered. "Jake!" Thomas called out as he reined in his horse, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "What's all this commotion about?" Jake's jaw tightened, but he stepped back from Elena, his hands unclenching slowly. "Nothing important, Pa. Just having a conversation with Miss Vasquez here about her interesting hands." Thomas's steel-blue eyes, so similar to his son's but infinitely wiser, took in the scene with practiced assessment. He saw Elena's flushed face, the way she cradled her scarred hand against her chest, the expectant faces of the crowd waiting to see what would happen next. "I see," Thomas said simply. His gaze lingered on Elena for a moment, and something flickered across his weathered features, not quite sympathy, but perhaps a recognition of injustice. "Well, I'm sure Miss Vasquez has business to attend to just as we do. Come along, son. Your mother's expecting us for supper. It wasn't a request." And Jake knew better than to argue with his father in public. With a final sneer at Elena, he swaggered toward his own horse, a magnificent bay stallion named Thunder that was tied up outside the saloon. "This ain't over," Jake muttered as he passed Elena, his words meant for her ears alone. "Next time your daddy ain't around to protect you with his important presence. We'll finish this conversation properly." Elena watched as the Callahan men rode out of town, her heart still hammering in her chest. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment over for the day, but she could feel their curious stares lingering on her like unwelcome touches. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Henry Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly from the store's doorway. You still need that flour, Miss Elena?" She nodded mutely, following him into the blessed coolness of the general store. As she conducted her business in silence, counting out her meager coins with trembling fingers, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Jake Callahan's words had been more than just idle threats. There would indeed be a next time, and when it came, she doubted it would end as peacefully as this encounter had. Outside, the sun continued its relentless assault on the dusty streets of Millbrook Falls, unaware that the events of this seemingly ordinary afternoon had set in motion a chain of circumstances that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. The scars on Elena's hands, mocked and ridiculed just moments before, would soon prove to hold secrets that not even she fully understood. As Eleanor emerged from the store with her small bundle of supplies, she cast one last glance down Main Street toward the direction the Callahans had ridden. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled ominously across the Texas sky, though whether it came from gathering storm clouds or something else entirely remained to be seen. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation on Main Street, and the September nights were growing cooler across the Texas plains. The Callahan Ranch sprawled across nearly 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, its boundaries marked by miles of split-rail fencing that gleamed white in the moonlight. The main house sat on a gentle rise overlooking the valley, a sprawling structure of limestone and timber that spoke of generations of prosperity built on the backs of cattle and the sweat of hired hands. Jake stood on the wraparound porch of the ranch house, a glass of bourbon in his hand and a scowl etched deep into his features. The amber liquid burned as it went down, but it did nothing to ease the irritation that had been gnawing at him since that afternoon in town. Word of his encounter with Elena Vasquez had spread like wildfire through the community, and while most folks were careful not to criticize Callahan directly, Jake could sense their judgment in their sideways glances and whispered conversations. The sound of approaching hooves interrupted his brooding. Marcus Webb, the ranch foreman, emerged from the darkness astride his reliable paint horse. Marcus was a lean, weathered man in his 50s who had worked for the Callahan family since before Jake was born. His loyalty was unquestioned, but his respect had to be earned daily, and Jake sometimes wondered if he'd done enough earning lately. "Evening, Jake," Marcus called out as he dismounted, tying his horse to the porch rail with practiced efficiency. "Thought you'd want to know. We found where those cattle have been disappearing to. Jake straightened, his attention sharpening. Over the past month, they'd been losing steers at an alarming rate, not to rustlers or natural predators, but to something far more mysterious. The animals would simply vanish from the south pasture, leaving behind no trace of their passage. Where? Canyon Creek Ravine, about 2 miles southeast of here. Looks like they've been falling through a section of ground that's gone soft from underground springs. Must have opened up recently, maybe from all that rain we had in August. Marcus removed his hat, running his fingers through his graying hair. Lost count at 20 head before it got too dark to see properly, Jake cursed under his breath. 20 heads of prime beef represented a significant loss, even for a ranch the size of theirs. More importantly, it was another problem he'd have to explain to his father. Another example of his supposed inability to manage ranch operations effectively. Get a crew together at first light, Jake ordered, finishing his bourbon in one burning gulp. We'll need to rope off that area and figure out how to recover the carcasses before they start attracting buzzards and coyotes. Marcus nodded, but his expression suggested there was more to report. There's something else, Jake, something strange. Found horse tracks near the ravine, fresh ones, from maybe this afternoon. Single rider, moving carefully along the edge, where the ground's still solid. Probably just one of our hands checking the area. That's what I thought at first. But the shoe marks don't match any of our stock. These were smaller, lighter. More like a Mustang or quarter horse than the draft animals we keep. Marcus's weathered face creased into a frown. Whoever it was, they knew exactly where the dangerous ground started and stopped. Rode the perimeter like they'd mapped it out personally. Jake's jaw tightened. The last thing they needed was some nosy neighbor poking around their property, especially if word got out about the cattle losses. Bad enough that his competence was already being questioned without adding rumors of mismanagement to the mix. Double the night patrols, he decided. If someone's scouting our land, I want to know about it. Marcus touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement before remounting his horse. As the foreman rode back toward the bunkhouse, Jake remained on the porch, his mind churning with possibilities. The mysterious rider bothered him more than he cared to admit. Something about the careful, knowledgeable way they'd navigated the dangerous terrain suggested this wasn't a casual trespasser. Inside the house, the grandfather clock in the front hall chimed 10 times, its deep bronze notes echoing through the limestone corridors. Jake made his way to the stables, where the familiar sounds and scents of horses provided a measure of comfort. The Callahan family had always prided itself on breeding some of the finest horses in Texas, and their stable complex reflected that commitment. Thunder, Jake's prize stallion, occupied the largest stall at the end of the barn. The magnificent bay horse was Jake's pride and joy, a 17-hand thoroughbred with bloodlines that traced back to English racing champions. At 6 years old, Thunder was in his prime, with the speed and stamina that made him the envy of every horseman in the county. But as Jake approached the stall, something was clearly wrong. Thunder stood with his head hanging low, his usually pristine coat dull and matted with sweat. The horse's breathing was labored, and his eyes, normally bright and alert, appeared glassy and unfocused. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, entering the stall with the careful movements of someone who understood that sick animals could be unpredictable. Thunder barely acknowledged his presence, a fact that sent a chill of fear down Jake's spine. This horse was his constant companion, as responsive to his moods as a faithful dog. Jake ran his hands along Thunder's neck and shoulders, feeling the heat radiating from the animal's skin. The horse's pulse was rapid and irregular, and his gums had taken on an alarming pale color that spoke of serious illness. Whatever was wrong had come on suddenly. Thunder had been perfectly healthy that morning when Jake had ridden him around the perimeter of the north pasture. "Miguel!" Jake shouted, his voice carrying the edge of panic he tried to suppress. Miguel Santana was their head stable hand, a stocky man in his 40s who possessed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose and treat equine ailments. Within moments, Miguel appeared at the stall door, his dark eyes taking in the situation with practiced assessment. "Dios mío," Miguel breathed, crossing himself as he observed Thunder's condition. "When did this start?" "I don't know. He was fine this morning, but look at him now." Jake's voice cracked slightly, betraying the depth of his attachment to the animal. "What's wrong with him?" Miguel entered the stall, his movements slow and deliberate as he began his examination. He checked Thunder's temperature, listened to his heart and breathing, examined his eyes and mouth with the thoroughness of a physician treating a human patient. "His temperature is very high," Miguel reported, his accented English heavy with concern. "Heart rate too fast, breathing shallow. These symptoms, I've seen them before, but not often. And when I saw them..." He trailed off, unwilling to voice the grim prognosis they both understood. "What are you saying?" Jake demanded. Though he dreaded the answer, Miguel's weathered face was grave as he met Jake's eyes. "I am saying we may lose him, senor. This sickness comes fast and kills faster. In Mexico, we called it la muerte silenciosa, the silent death. Horses can be healthy at sunrise and dead before sunset." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Thunder wasn't just a horse. He was a symbol of everything Jake took pride in, a living representation of his status and skill as a horseman. More than that, the animal represented one of the few relationships in Jake's life that was based on mutual respect rather than fear or obligation. "There has to be something we can do," Jake said, his voice tight with desperation. "Send someone to fetch Doc Morrison from town. Hell, send 2 riders. Have them bring any veterinarian they can find within 100 miles. "See, I will send riders immediately," Miguel agreed, though his tone suggested little hope. "But, senor, you must understand, by the time a doctor arrives, it may be too late. This sickness, it does not wait for convenient timing." Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The helplessness was almost unbearable, made worse by the knowledge that for all his wealth and influence, he couldn't simply command this problem to disappear. Thunder's labored breathing filled the stable with an ominous soundtrack that seemed to mock Jake's powerlessness. "There must be something else," Jake muttered, more to himself than to Miguel. "Some old remedy, some folk cure." "What did people do before veterinarians?" Miguel's expression grew thoughtful. "In the old country, sometimes people would try unusual methods. Curanderos, healers who worked with herbs and other things. But, senor, these are just superstitions, stories told by old women." "I don't care if it's witchcraft," Jake snapped. "If there's even a chance it could help, I want to try it." Miguel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "There are rumors, senor. Stories about a young woman who lives outside town. They say she has a gift, that she can heal animals with her touch. But these are just tales told by ignorant people." Jake's blood ran cold as understanding dawned. "You're talking about Elena Vasquez. See, that is the name I have heard whispered." "But, senor, surely you cannot be considering..." Miguel's voice trailed off as he saw the desperate determination in Jake's eyes. The irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. 3 weeks ago, Jake had publicly humiliated Elena, mocking her scarred hands and questioning her worth as a human being. Now those same hands might represent his only hope of saving the creature he valued most in the world. Thunder's condition continued to deteriorate as the evening wore on. By 11 o'clock, the magnificent stallion could barely stand, his legs trembling with the effort of supporting his weight. His breathing had become increasingly labored, each inhalation a struggle that might be his last. Jake had exhausted every conventional option. 2 riders had been dispatched to fetch medical help, but even if they rode their horses to death in the attempt, no doctor could possibly arrive before morning. By then, Jake was grimly certain it would be too late. Standing in the doorway of Thunder's stall, watching his beloved horse slowly dying, Jake faced a choice that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. His pride, his reputation, his very identity as the untouchable heir to the Callahan legacy, all of it paled in comparison to the life hanging in the balance before him. The stable was quiet except for Thunder's tortured breathing, and the distant sounds of night insects, chirping in the darkness beyond the barn walls. Jake closed his eyes, wrestled with his demons, and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would swallow his pride and seek help from the very person he had so cruelly wronged. Elena Vasquez, with her mysterious scarred hands and her reputation for healing, represented Thunder's only chance for survival. The question was whether she would be willing to help the man who had made her life miserable, or if Jake's cruelty had finally come back to exact its price when he needed mercy most, the grandfather clock in the main. House began to chime the midnight hour as Jake saddled a fresh horse and prepared to ride into the darkness. His destination a humble homestead on the outskirts of town, where a quiet girl with wounded hands held the power to save. Or damn the thing he treasured most in this world, the Vasquez homestead, sat in a hollow between two low hills, shielded from the worst of the prairie winds by a grove of cottonwood trees that rustled like whispered secrets in the darkness. The modest adobe house, built by Elena's grandfather decades earlier, seemed to huddle against the landscape as if trying to remain invisible to the outside world. A small barn, chicken coop and vegetable garden completed the property, everything maintained with the careful precision of people who couldn't afford to waste anything. Jake's borrowed horse picked its way carefully down the narrow dirt path that led to the Vasquez property, the animal's hooves muffled by the thick dust that hadn't seen rain in over a week. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the star-scattered sky, providing just enough light to navigate by, but casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward Jake with grasping fingers. As he approached the house, Jake could see a warm glow emanating from one of the windows. Candlelight, he realized, not the harsh glare of electric bulbs. The Vasquez family clearly couldn't afford modern conveniences, a fact that would have provided Jake with ammunition for mockery under normal circumstances. Tonight, however, such observations felt petty and insignificant. Jake dismounted near a wooden fence post that had seen better decades, his boots touching ground that felt foreign beneath his feet. He'd never set foot on property this humble, never needed to venture beyond the boundaries of his family's prosperous world. The experience was unsettling in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Before he could lose his nerve, Jake strode to the front door and knocked, not with the imperious pounding he might normally employ, but with the measured rhythm of someone requesting rather than demanding. The sound seemed to echo in the stillness of the night, and for a moment Jake wondered if anyone was actually awake at this late hour. Footsteps approached from within, light and cautious. The door opened just a crack, revealing a sliver of Elena's face, illuminated by flickering candlelight. Her dark eyes widened with surprise, and what might have been fear when she recognized her midnight visitor. "What do you want?" Elena's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried an edge of wariness that Jake found he couldn't blame her for. "I need to talk to you," Jake said, his usual commanding tone notably absent. It's about something important." Elena's grip tightened on the door handle. "It's past midnight, Mr. Callahan. Whatever you want can surely wait until morning." "No, it can't." Jake's voice cracked slightly, betraying the desperation he was trying to hide. "Please, Elena, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but this isn't about me. It's about someone else who's going to die if I don't find help." Something in his tone must have reached her, because Elena's expression shifted from suspicion to curiosity. She opened the door wider, revealing that she was fully dressed despite the late hour, as if she'd been unable to sleep. "What are you talking about?" Jake removed his hat, an unconscious gesture of respect that surprised them both. "My horse, Thunder. He's dying, and the doctors can't get here in time." Miguel Santana said. "He said you might be able to help." Elena's face went pale in the candlelight. "I don't know what stories you've heard, but I'm not a veterinarian. I can't perform miracles." "Maybe not," Jake admitted, his voice growing more desperate. "But I've heard the rumors, Elena. People say you have a gift, that you can heal things with your hands." The same hands I... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would acknowledge his cruelty. The same hands you mocked in front of half the town, Elena finished for him, her voice carrying no accusation, only a statement of fact. Jake's jaw worked silently for a moment before he managed to speak again. Yes, the same hands I was cruel about, and I'm sorrier for that than you'll ever know. But right now I'm not asking for my sake. I'm asking for Thunder's. He's innocent in all this. Eleanor studied Jake's face in the flickering light, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was raw, unguarded anguish, the kind of pain that couldn't be faked or manufactured for effect. Even if the stories were true, Elena said slowly, why would you think I'd help you after what you did? It was a fair question, one that Jake had been dreading during the long ride from his ranch. Because I'm hoping you're a better person than I am, he said simply. Because I'm hoping you won't let an innocent animal suffer for my mistakes. Elena's scarred hands, hidden in the folds of her nightgown, trembled slightly. The truth was that the stories people whispered weren't entirely fiction, though they were far from the complete picture. She did have an unusual ability with injured animals, a gift that had manifested during her childhood and grown stronger over the years. But it came at a cost that few people understood, and using it always left her drained and vulnerable. Tell me about your horse, Elena said, still not committing to help, but no longer rejecting the possibility outright. Jake's relief was palpable as he launched into a description of Thunder's symptoms. Elena listened intently, her medical knowledge gleaned from years of treating injured livestock and wild animals. The picture Jake painted was grim: high fever, irregular heartbeat, labored breathing, and rapid deterioration that suggested poisoning or severe infection. How long has he been sick? Elena asked. Miguel thinks it started this afternoon, but I didn't notice anything until around 10 o'clock tonight. By the time I left to come here, he could barely stand. Jake's voice broke slightly on the last words. Elena closed her eyes, weighing the decision that could change everything. If she helped Jake and word got out about her abilities, her family's already precarious position in the community could become impossible. But if she refused and the horse died, she'd have to live with the knowledge that her pride had cost an innocent life. I'll need to see him first, Elena said finally. I can't promise anything, but I'll look at him. Jake's knees nearly buckled with relief. Thank you, he breathed. I'll saddle a horse for you, or if you prefer, you can ride behind me. I have my own horse, Elena interrupted, disappearing into the house for a moment before returning with a worn leather satchel and a heavy shawl. Give me a minute to wake my father and let him know where I'm going. Jake waited in the darkness, his heart hammering with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Within minutes, Elena emerged from the small barn, leading a compact sorrel mare that moved with the sure-footed grace of an animal accustomed to rough terrain. The ride back to the Callahan Ranch passed in tense silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the night sounds of the Texas plains. Elena rode with the easy competence of someone raised in the saddle, her mare keeping pace with Jake's larger horse, despite the difference in their builds. As they crested the rise that overlooked the Callahan Ranch, Elena couldn't help but be impressed by the sheer scale of the operation. Buildings that would have housed her entire extended family served as mere outbuildings here, and the main stable complex was larger than most barns in the county. Jake led her directly to the stables, where several oil lanterns cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Miguel Santana was waiting for them, his weathered face etched with worry and exhaustion. He looked surprised to see Elena but said nothing, stepping aside to let her approach Thunder's stall. Elena's first glimpse of the magnificent stallion took her breath away. Even in his current condition, Thunder was clearly an exceptional animal, tall, powerfully built, with lines that spoke of careful breeding and generations of refinement. But his current state was heartbreaking. The proud horse stood, with his head hanging low, his coat dark with sweat, his breathing labored and painful to watch. "May I go in?" Elena asked quietly. Jake nodded, opening the stall door with hands that shook slightly. Elena entered slowly, her movements calm and deliberate as she approached the suffering animal. Thunder barely acknowledged her presence, too lost in his illness to register the newcomer. Elena placed her hands gently on Thunder's neck, feeling the heat radiating from his skin and the irregular flutter of his pulse. But more than that, she sensed something else, a darkness that went beyond physical illness, something that felt almost malevolent in its intensity. "This isn't a natural sickness," Eleanor said, her voice carrying an odd certainty that made both men look at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Jake asked. Elena's hands moved over Thunder's body with practiced efficiency, mapping the areas of heat and tension, feeling for the source of whatever was attacking the horse's system. Her scarred palms seemed to tingle as they passed over certain spots, as if responding to some invisible signal. "Something poisoned him," Elena said after several minutes of examination. "But not with a plant or chemical. This feels different, older somehow." She looked up at Jake, her dark eyes serious. "Has Thunder been anywhere unusual today? Eaten anything different, drunk from a new water source?" Jake thought frantically, trying to reconstruct Thunder's day. "I rode him out to check the south pasture this morning, same route we always take. He drank from Canyon Creek like he has 100 times before, grazed on the same grass." Jake's voice trailed off as a horrible possibility occurred to him. "The ravine," he whispered. "Miguel, you said there were fresh horse tracks near where the cattle died. What if Thunder got too close to whatever killed them?" Miguel's face went ashen. "Dios mío, if the water downstream from that ravine has been contaminated." Elena's hands had never stopped moving over Thunder's body, and now she could feel something responding to her touch, not the horse's natural healing processes, but whatever foreign presence was attacking his system. It felt ancient and malicious, like something that had been sleeping in the earth for countless years before being disturbed. "I can try to help him," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you both to understand. What I'm about to do isn't medicine as you know it. It's something else, something most people wouldn't understand or accept." Jake looked at Thunder's deteriorating condition and made his choice without hesitation. "I don't care what it is. If it can save him, do it." Elena nodded, then did something that surprised both men. She began to remove her gloves, exposing the intricate network of scars that covered her hands. In the lantern light, the old wounds seemed to gleam with their own inner luminescence, creating patterns that appeared almost deliberate in their complexity. "These scars aren't from an accident," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a weight of long-held secrets. "They're from the first time I tried to heal something that was beyond my ability. I was 12 years old, and I nearly died learning that some gifts come with a price." She placed her scarred palms directly on Thunder's chest, over his laboring heart, and closed her eyes. What happened next would challenge everything Jake thought he knew about the world, and forever change his understanding of the quiet girl he had so cruelly wronged. The moment Elena's scarred palms made contact with Thunder's chest, the world seemed to shift on its axis. The stable fell into an unnatural silence. Even the usual night sounds of crickets and distant cattle ceased, as if all of creation was holding its breath. The lantern flames flickered without any breeze to disturb them, casting wavering shadows that danced across the wooden walls like living things. Jake watched in stunned fascination as Elena's face transformed. The shy, uncertain expression he was accustomed to seeing melted away, replaced by something ancient and knowing. Her dark eyes remained closed, but her breathing deepened, becoming synchronized with Thunder's labored rhythm. The scars on her hands began to emit a faint luminescence, barely perceptible at first, but growing steadily brighter. Thunder's massive body shuddered as Elena's hands pressed more firmly against his chest. The stallion's head lifted slightly, his glassy eyes focusing for the first time in hours. But rather than improvement, what followed made Jake's blood run cold. Elena gasped sharply, her body going rigid as if she'd been struck by lightning. The luminescence from her scars flared brilliantly, casting the entire stall in an otherworldly blue-white glow. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources, as if the air itself was speaking through her. "I can see it," she whispered, her words echoing strangely in the confined space. "It's old, so old. It was sleeping in the earth, dreaming of darkness, until the springs disturbed its rest." Jake and Miguel exchanged terrified glances. This was far beyond anything either man had expected or prepared for. Miguel crossed himself repeatedly, muttering prayers in rapid Spanish, while Jake found himself frozen between the urge to flee and the desperate need to save his horse. Elena's scarred hands moved across Thunder's body with purpose now, tracing patterns that seemed to follow invisible pathways. Wherever she touched, the horse's muscles relaxed slightly, but the effort was clearly taking its toll on her. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool night air, and her breathing became increasingly labored. "What do you see?" Jake managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "Pain," Elena replied, her tone distant and ethereal. "Ancient pain that feeds on life force, growing stronger with each creature it claims. It entered Thunder through the water, but it's not of this world. It's something that fell from the sky long ago, before men walked this land." As she spoke, images flashed behind Elena's closed eyelids, visions of a time when the Texas plains were covered by prehistoric seas, when strange lights fell from the heavens to bury themselves deep in the primordial mud. She saw the thing that now poisoned Thunder, a fragment of something vast and malevolent, dormant for millennia until the shifting underground springs had given it access to the surface world once again. Thunder's condition began to fluctuate wildly. One moment he seemed to rally, his breathing easing and his posture straightening. The next, he would collapse against the stall wall, his body racked with convulsions that threatened to tear him apart. Through it all, Elena maintained her connection, her scarred hands never breaking contact, even as the effort drained her strength. "It's fighting back," Elena said through gritted teeth. "It doesn't want to let go. It's been hungry for so long, and Thunder is strong. His life force is pure, untainted. The thing wants to keep him." Jake watched helplessly as the battle raged within his beloved horse. He could see the conflict playing out in Thunder's eyes. Moments of clarity, followed by periods where something else seemed to be looking out through those familiar brown orbs. Something cold and utterly alien. "Can you save him?" Jake asked, his voice breaking with desperation. Elena didn't answer immediately. Her entire body was trembling now, and the light emanating from her scars had grown so bright that both men had to squint to look at her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of grim determination. "There's a way," she said, "but it will cost more than you understand. The thing inside Thunder is too strong to simply drive out. It has to be drawn into something else, something it finds even more appealing than your horse." Understanding dawned on Jake like a physical blow. "You're talking about taking it into yourself." Elena's nod was barely perceptible, but it confirmed his worst fears. "My scars aren't just from healing," she whispered. "They're from the times I've had to absorb sickness and poison to save others. Each mark represents something I've taken on, something that left a permanent mark on my body and soul." Miguel stepped forward, his weathered face etched with concern. "Señorita, you cannot do this thing. To take such evil into yourself, it could kill you or worse." "I know the risks," Elena replied, her voice growing stronger despite her physical exhaustion. "But I also know that Thunder will die if I don't try. And if this thing escapes into the general water supply, it won't stop with one horse. It will spread, infecting every animal that drinks from the contaminated streams." Jake's mind reeled as the implications hit him. If Elena was right, this wasn't just about saving Thunder. It was about preventing a plague that could devastate every ranch and farm for miles around. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a crushing burden. "There has to be another way," Jake said desperately. "Some other method that doesn't put you at risk." Elena's scarred hands pulsed with renewed light as she delved deeper into Thunder's affliction. "I can see its memories," she said, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "Eons of hunger, of waiting in the darkness. It remembers the time before, when creatures larger than thunder roamed these plains. It fed on them too, until they were all gone, and it was forced to sleep. The stallion's body convulsed again, more violently than before. Foam flecked with blood appeared at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes rolled back until only the white showed. Whatever was inside him was growing stronger, fighting Elena's attempts to contain it. "I can't hold it much longer," Elena gasped, her own body beginning to show signs of the strain. "It's too strong, too hungry. If I'm going to save him, it has to be now." Jake looked at Thunder, at Elena, at the impossible choice that lay before them. In that moment, he understood that everything he'd thought he knew about the world had been stripped away. Magic was real, ancient evils slumbered beneath the earth, and a girl he'd mocked and tormented was the only thing standing between his horse and a fate worse than death. "Do it," Jake said, his voice barely audible, but filled with conviction. "Whatever the cost, save him." Elena's eyes snapped open, fixing Jake with a stare that seemed to look straight through him. "You don't understand what you're asking. If I take this thing into myself, there's no guarantee I'll survive. And if I do survive, I'll never be the same. The scars on my hands will spread, marking every place the evil touches. I'll carry a piece of this ancient hunger inside me forever." "Why?" Jake asked, struggling to understand. "Why would you do that for me after everything I've done to you?" Elena's expression softened slightly, revealing the frightened young woman beneath the mystical healer. "Not for you," she said simply. "For Thunder, and for all the innocent creatures that will die if this evil spreads. Some fights are worth the cost, no matter who benefits." Before Jake could respond, Elena placed both hands flat against Thunder's chest and closed her eyes once more. The light from her scars exploded outward, filling the stable with radiance so intense that both men had to shield their eyes. Through the blazing luminescence, they could hear Elena's voice raised in what sounded like an ancient chant, words in a language neither of them recognized. Thunder's body went completely rigid, his back arching as something dark and oily began to seep from his pores. The substance moved with purpose, flowing across his coat like liquid shadow before encountering Elena's hands. The moment it touched her scarred skin, Elena screamed, a sound of such raw agony that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The dark substance poured into Elena's hands, absorbed through the intricate network of old scars, as if they were channels designed for this exact purpose. With each drop that entered her body, new scars appeared on her arms, spreading up from her hands in branching patterns that glowed with their own malevolent light. Jake watched in horror as Elena's body began to change. Her skin took on an ashen pallor, and her breathing became labored. But her grip on Thunder never wavered, even as the ancient evil fought against its new prison. The battle reached its crescendo when Elena's entire body convulsed, her back arching as the last of the dark substance left Thunder and settled into its new host. For a moment that seemed to last forever, she hung suspended between life and death, between salvation and damnation. Then, with a sound like thunder rolling across the plains, the supernatural light vanished. Elena collapsed to the stable floor, her body limp and motionless. The new scars that covered her arms continued to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with her barely perceptible heartbeat. Thunder, meanwhile, stood tall and strong, his breathing deep and regular for the first time in hours. The magnificent stallion looked around the stable with clear, intelligent eyes, as if awakening from a terrible nightmare. He was completely healed, restored to perfect health by Elena's sacrifice. Jake dropped to his knees beside Elena's unconscious form, his hands hovering over her, but afraid to touch her transformed skin. "Elena, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, but they were different now, darker, deeper, holding shadows that hadn't been there before. When she spoke, her voice carried an echo of the ancient things she had absorbed. "It's done," she whispered. "Thunder is free." "But the price?" She lifted her arms, staring at the new scars that decorated her skin like intricate tattoos. "I can feel it inside me, sleeping but not gone. I'll carry this burden for the rest of my life." Jake felt tears he hadn't shed since childhood burning at his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, the words completely inadequate for the magnitude of what had just occurred. "I'm so sorry for everything." Elena struggled to sit up, her movements careful and deliberate. "Help me to my feet," she said. "I need to get home before dawn. My family will worry." As Jake and Miguel helped Elena stand, she swayed slightly, but remained upright through sheer force of will. The transformation she had undergone was immediately apparent. The quiet, timid girl who had entered the stable was gone, replaced by someone who had stared into the abyss and emerged forever changed. Thunder approached Elena slowly, his massive head lowering until his muzzle touched her scarred hand. The gesture was gentle, almost reverent, as if the magnificent stallion understood exactly what she had sacrificed for his sake. "He knows," Elena said softly, stroking Thunder's neck with hands that now bore the permanent marks of her heroism. Animals always know when someone has saved their life. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Elena prepared to leave the Callahan ranch. But both she and Jake understood that everything had changed irrevocably. The cruel words spoken in town, the midnight ride for help, the supernatural healing, all of it had woven their fates together in ways that could never be undone. The week following Thunder's miraculous recovery passed in a strange, suspended tension that seemed to hover over Millbrook Falls, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Word of the stallion's sudden illness and equally sudden cure had spread through the community with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. But the details remained frustratingly vague to those who hadn't witnessed the events firsthand. Jake found himself in the unfamiliar position of deflecting questions rather than commanding attention. Ranch hands, neighbors, and casual acquaintances all pressed him for details about Thunder's mysterious ailment. But Jake remained tight-lipped, offering only the most basic explanations about calling in a local healer when the veterinarians couldn't arrive in time. The truth was far more complex and unsettling than he could ever admit publicly. Jake had always prided himself on his rationality, his ability to solve problems through wealth, influence, or sheer force of will. The events in the stable had shattered that worldview completely, revealing a universe where ancient evils lurked beneath familiar ground and miracles came at costs too terrible to calculate. Thunder himself seemed oblivious to the attention his recovery had generated. The magnificent stallion moved with renewed vigor, his coat gleaming with health and his eyes bright with intelligence. But Jake noticed subtle changes in his horse's behavior, a new gentleness in his movements, a tendency to pause and listen to sounds that others couldn't hear, and an almost protective stance whenever Jake appeared troubled or distressed. It was as if Thunder understood that his life had been purchased with someone else's suffering, and he was determined to prove worthy of that sacrifice. Elena, meanwhile, had retreated to her family's homestead immediately after the healing, and hadn't been seen in town since that night. Jake had ridden past the Vasquez property twice, ostensibly checking fence lines or surveying water sources, but he'd caught no glimpse of her. The small adobe house seemed shuttered and withdrawn, smoke rising from the chimney being the only sign of habitation. Jake's conscience, never particularly active in his younger years, had awakened with a vengeance. Every time he looked at Thunder's healthy form, he was reminded of Elena's sacrifice and his own role in making that sacrifice necessary. The memory of her transformation haunted his dreams, the way new scars had spread across her arms like living tattoos, the shadows that had crept into her eyes, the echo of ancient hunger in her voice. On the 7th day after the healing, Jake's internal struggle reached a breaking point. He'd spent the morning trying to focus on ranch business, reviewing cattle counts, and discussing market prices with Marcus Webb, but his attention kept drifting. Finally, unable to bear the weight of his guilt any longer, Jake saddled Thunder and rode toward town. The main street of Millbrook Falls bustled with its usual midday activity, merchants conducting business, children playing between the buildings, women discussing the latest community news in small clusters. But Jake noticed something different in the way people looked at him now. The automatic deference was still there, but it was tempered by curiosity and something that might have been respect. Word had gotten out that Jake Callahan had swallowed his pride to seek help for his horse, and that simple act had subtly altered his standing in the community. People saw him as slightly more human, slightly less untouchable than before. Jake tied Thunder to the hitching post outside Morrison's general store and made his way inside. Henry Morrison looked up from his ledger books, his weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile. "Afternoon, Jake. Good to see Thunder looking so spry. That local healer you found must know her business." "She does," Jake replied, his voice carrying a gravity that made Morrison glance at him sharply. "Henry, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. What do you know about the Vasquez family? About Elena specifically?" Morrison set down his pen, clearly recognizing that this wasn't idle curiosity. "Well, they've been part of this community for 3 generations. Elena's grandfather, Roberto, was one of the finest horsemen I ever knew. Good gentle the wildest mustang without breaking its spirit. Her father, Carlos, has that same gift, though he's had to focus more on farming to make ends meet. And Elena..." Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. "Elena's always been different. Quiet, keeps to herself mostly, but there've been stories over the years. Injured animals that somehow recover after she tends to them. Crops that thrive in drought conditions on their property when everyone else's are failing. Nothing you could point to and call supernatural, but patterns." Jake leaned against the counter, processing this information. "What kind of patterns?" "Well, there was the Henderson boy's dog about 3 years ago. Got kicked by a mule, internal injuries that Doc Morrison said would be fatal. Elena spent an afternoon with that animal, and by evening it was walking around like nothing had happened. Then there was the drought of '89. Every farm for miles lost their harvest, but the Vasquez property stayed green. Elena was seen walking their fields at dawn and dusk, her hands pressed to the earth like she was listening for something." Morrison paused, studying Jake's face carefully. "Course, there've always been darker whispers too. Some folks say Elena's gift comes from places decent people don't truck with. Say she's made bargains that no Christian woman should make. But I've known that family my whole life, and I can tell you they're good people, whatever else might be true." Jake absorbed this information with growing unease. If Elena had been using her abilities for years, absorbing injuries and ailments from countless creatures, what kind of toll had that taken on her body and soul? How many scars lay hidden beneath her modest clothing, and how much darkness had she accumulated over the years? "Henry," Jake said slowly, "if someone wanted to help the Vasquez family, financially I mean, how would they go about it without making it seem like charity?" Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a change of tune from a week ago, if you don't mind my saying so." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he didn't deny the implication. People change. Circumstances change. "I'm asking a practical question." "Well," Morrison said thoughtfully, "Carlos has been struggling to keep up with the mortgage payments on their property. Bank's been patient so far, but patience has limits. If someone were to anonymously settle that debt, it would go a long way towards securing their future." "How much?" Morrison named a figure that would have seemed insignificant to Jake under normal circumstances, but now carried the weight of true significance. "I could make discreet inquiries with the bank if you're serious about this." "I'm serious," Jake said, "but it has to be completely anonymous. The family can't know it came from me." After leaving Morrison's store, Jake walked the length of Main Street, his mind churning with plans and possibilities. Settling the Vasquez family's debt was just a starting point. There had to be other ways to improve their situation without making his involvement obvious. His contemplation was interrupted by a commotion near the town's small church. A crowd had gathered around something or someone, their voices carrying tones of excitement and concern. Jake pushed through the group to see what had captured their attention. In the center of the crowd stood Father Miguel Santos, the elderly priest who had served the community for over 2 decades. His weathered hands held a small bundle wrapped in rough cloth, an injured barn owl, its wing bent at an unnatural angle and its bright eyes clouded with pain. "Found her near the church steps this morning," Father Santos was explaining to the gathered townspeople. "Some predator got to her, but she's still alive. Don't rightly know what can be done for a wild creature like this. Put it out of its misery," suggested one of the onlookers. "Kindest thing, really." Jake found himself speaking before he'd consciously decided to. "Take it to Elena Vasquez." The crowd turned to stare at him, surprise evident on their faces. Jake Callahan publicly recommending the strange Vasquez girl was not something anyone had expected to hear. "Elena has a way with injured animals," Jake continued, his voice gaining strength. "If anyone can help that owl, she can." Father Santos studied Jake's face with the penetrating gaze that had made him an effective spiritual counselor for decades. "That's a generous suggestion, Mr. Callahan. Would you be willing to make the introduction? I'm afraid Elena doesn't know me well, and she might be more comfortable with a familiar face present." Jake almost laughed at the irony. Familiar face indeed. He was probably the last person Elena wanted to see, given their history and the events of the previous week. But the priest's request gave him the excuse he'd been looking for to check on Elena's condition. "I'll take the owl to her myself," Jake offered, gently taking the bundled bird from Father Santos. "It's the least I can do." The crowd began to disperse, but Jake caught fragments of whispered conversations as people moved away. His public endorsement of Elena's abilities had clearly surprised them, and he could already sense the shift in community perception beginning to take hold. Jake rode toward the Vasquez homestead with the injured owl cradled carefully in one arm, Thunder's Gate smooth and steady beneath him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie, and the air carried the scent of autumn grasses and distant rain. As he approached the familiar grove of cottonwood trees that sheltered the Vasquez property, Jake felt his nervousness increasing. He hadn't seen Elena since that transformative night in the stable, and he wasn't sure what to expect. Would she be angry at his intrusion? Would the darkness she'd absorbed have changed her beyond recognition? The small adobe house looked much as it had before, but Jake noticed new details that spoke of subtle changes. The vegetable garden showed signs of unusual vitality, with plants that should have been withering in the autumn heat, instead displaying lush growth. The very air around the property seemed different somehow, thicker, charged with potential that made the hair on Jake's arms stand on end. Jake dismounted and approached the front door, the injured owl stirring restlessly in his arms. Before he could knock, the door opened to reveal Carlos Vasquez, Elena's father. The man was in his 40s, with weathered hands and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Callahan," Carlos said, his tone carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I brought something that needs Elena's attention," Jake replied, indicating the bundled owl. "If she's willing to see me, that is." Carlos's expression softened as he saw the injured bird. "Elena is resting, but she'll want to help. Please come inside." Jake stepped into the modest home, immediately struck by its atmosphere of quiet dignity. The furnishings were simple but well crafted, and religious icons shared wall space with dried herbs and what appeared to be medicinal plants. The air was thick with the scent of healing herbs and something else, something that reminded Jake uncomfortably of the supernatural energy that had filled his stable a week ago. "Elena," Carlos called softly toward a door at the back of the house. "There's someone here who needs your help." The door opened, and Elena emerged from what Jake assumed was her bedroom. The sight of her hit him like a physical blow. She was recognizably the same person, but the transformation was profound. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and the new scars that decorated her arms were clearly visible even beneath the long sleeves of her dress. But it was her eyes that showed the greatest change. They held depths that seemed to contain entire worlds of shadow and knowledge. When Elena saw Jake, she paused for just a moment before her gaze shifted to the bundle in his arms. "What happened to it?" "Father Santos found it near the church. Wings broken, maybe internal injuries too. I told him you might be able to help." Elena approached without hesitation, her scarred hands gentle as she took the owl from Jake's arms. The moment her skin made contact with the bird, both creature and healer went completely still. Jake watched in fascination as Elena's eyes closed and her breathing deepened, falling into the same rhythm he'd witnessed during Thunder's healing. But this time, there was no dramatic light show, no supernatural pyrotechnics. Instead, Elena's healing of the owl was a quiet, subtle process that seemed to flow as naturally as breathing. Her hands moved over the bird's injured wing with practiced efficiency, and Jake could actually see the bones realigning themselves beneath her touch within minutes. The owl's wing was perfectly straight, and its bright eyes had cleared of pain. Elena held the creature up to the window, allowing it to see the approaching dusk, then carried it outside. With a gentle toss, she released the owl into the evening air. It soared upward with powerful wing beats, circling once above the homestead as if in gratitude, before disappearing into the gathering darkness. "It's beautiful," Jake said softly, genuinely awed by what he'd witnessed. Elena turned to face him, and for the first time since their confrontation on Main Street, her expression held no trace of fear or resentment. "It's what I do," she said simply, "and what I've always done." Jake struggled to find the words for what he needed to say. "Elena, about what happened in town, about what you did for Thunder, I don't know how to thank you or how to apologize for—" "You don't need to," Elena interrupted. "What's done is done. Thunder is alive and healthy, and that's what matters." But Jake could see the cost written in the shadows under her eyes. In the careful way she moved, as if her body was still adjusting to the darkness she now carried. The girl who had sacrificed herself for his horse deserved more than his gratitude. She deserved his protection, his support, and his commitment to making amends for the cruelty he'd shown her. As the first stars appeared in the Texas sky, Jake made a silent vow. He would find ways to help Elena and her family, not out of guilt or obligation, but because it was the right thing to do. The events of the past week had taught him that there were forces in the world far more important than pride or social standing. Some debts could only be repaid through a lifetime of service, and Jake was finally ready to begin making payments on his. The October morning air carried the crisp promise of winter as Jake guided Thunder through the northern pastures of the Callahan Ranch. 3 weeks had passed since the owl healing, and the subtle changes in Millbrook Falls' social dynamics had become increasingly apparent. Jake's public endorsement of Elena's abilities had created ripples that continued to spread through the community, altering long-held perceptions and challenging established hierarchies. As Jake crested a low hill overlooking Canyon Creek, he was surprised to see several figures gathered near the site where Thunder had been poisoned. Drawing closer, he recognized Dr. William Hayes, the territorial government's geological surveyor, along with 2 assistants who were taking soil and water samples from various points along the creek bed. "Morning." "Dr. Hayes," Jake called out as he dismounted. "Didn't expect to see government men out here so early." Hayes, a thin, scholarly man in his 50s, looked up from his instruments with barely concealed excitement. "Mr. Callahan, perfect timing. I've been hoping to speak with you about some unusual readings we've been getting from this area." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of readings?" "Magnetic anomalies, primarily. There's something buried deep beneath this creek bed that's interfering with our compass readings. We've also found traces of minerals that shouldn't exist in this geological formation." Hayes gestured toward a series of small holes his assistants had dug along the creek bank. "Whatever it is, it's been affecting the groundwater chemistry for quite some distance downstream." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. If government surveyors were investigating the area, it was only a matter of time before they discovered the true source of the contamination. More importantly, their presence meant that other ranchers and farmers would soon learn that their water supplies might be compromised. "How long before you complete your survey?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Another week, perhaps 2. We'll need to bring in specialized equipment to determine exactly what we're dealing with. Hayes paused, studying Jake's expression. Is there something you're not telling me, Mr. Callahan? Some local knowledge that might help us understand what we've found? Jake weighed his options carefully. He could hardly explain that an ancient alien entity had been poisoning the water supply, or that it had been driven from his horse into a young woman who now carried it within her body. The truth was far too fantastic for a government scientist to accept. Just concerned about the water quality, Jake replied. We've had some livestock issues in this area recently. Hayes nodded knowingly. That would explain the elevated toxin levels we've detected. Whatever's down there has been leaching poisons into the groundwater. We'll need to issue warnings to all the ranchers and farmers who draw water from the affected streams. After the surveyors moved on to their next testing site, Jake remained by Canyon Creek, his mind racing with the implications of their discovery. If the government investigation continued, Elena's secret would eventually be exposed. Worse yet, if the alien presence within her was connected to the source buried beneath the creek, there was no telling what kind of attention that might draw. Jake remounted Thunder and rode directly to the Vasquez homestead, his urgency growing with each passing mile. He found Elena working in her family's vegetable garden, her movements deliberate and careful as she tended plants that showed impossible vitality despite the approaching winter. "Elena," Jake called out as he approached, "we need to talk. It's important." She looked up from the tomato plants she'd been examining, her transformed eyes immediately reading the concern in his expression. "What's wrong?" Jake dismounted and joined her in the garden, keeping his voice low despite the isolation of the property. "Government surveyors are investigating Canyon Creek. They've detected something unusual buried beneath the water source, something that's been contaminating the groundwater." Eleanor's scarred hands stilled on the tomato vine she'd been supporting. "How long before they find it?" Dr. Hayes said another week or two, depending on what equipment they can bring in. Jake studied her face, noting the way shadows seemed to gather in her eyes when she was troubled. "Elena, if they discover the source of the contamination, and if it's connected to what you absorbed from Thunder, they'll want to study me," Elena finished quietly. "They'll want to understand how I contain something their instruments can't even identify." The weight of the situation settled between them like a heavy blanket. Elena had sacrificed herself to save not only Thunder, but potentially every creature that depended on the region's water supply. Now that sacrifice might be discovered by authorities who wouldn't understand the supernatural nature of what had occurred. There might be a way to handle this, Jake said after several minutes of contemplation. "But it would require your family to trust me completely, and it would mean leaving everything you've known behind." Elena's father, Carlos, emerged from the small barn where he'd been repairing a broken harness. His weathered face showed immediate concern as he observed the serious conversation taking place in his garden. "What's this about leaving?" Carlos asked, approaching with the careful steps of a man who'd heard too many conversations that ended with his family being forced to relocate. Jake turned to include Carlos in the discussion, his respect for the older man evident in his posture and tone. "Mr. Vasquez, I need to explain something that's going to be hard to believe." Over the next 30 minutes, Jake recounted the events of the past month, Thunder's mysterious illness, Elena's supernatural healing, the ancient evil that now resided within her, and the government investigation that threatened to expose everything. Carlos listened in stunned silence, his eyes moving between Jake and his daughter as the incredible story unfolded. "You're saying my Elena has taken some kind of demon into herself?" Carlos asked when Jake finished. "Not a demon exactly," Elena said softly. "Something older, something that fell from the sky long before humans walked this land. It's sleeping now, contained by the same power that allowed me to heal Thunder. But it's still there." Carlos sank onto a wooden stool beside the garden path, the weight of this revelation clearly overwhelming him. "And you believe the government will discover this thing?" "It's inevitable," Jake replied. "Dr. Hayes and his team are systematic and thorough. They'll eventually locate the source of the contamination, and when they do, they'll want to know how it was contained. The trail will lead directly to Elena, so what are you proposing? Carlos asked. Jake had been formulating his plan during the ride from Canyon Creek, but speaking it aloud made him realize just how drastic his solution was. My family owns property in Colorado, near the town of Silver Creek. It's an isolated mountainous country where a family could live quietly without attracting attention. I could arrange for your relocation, help you establish a new homestead there. You're asking us to abandon our home, Carlos said, his voice heavy with the weight of 3 generations tied to this land. I'm asking you to save your daughter's life, Jake replied bluntly, and possibly your own lives as well. If the government discovers what Elena can do you really think they'll be content to study her from a distance? Elena had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke with a certainty that surprised both men. He's right, Papa. I can feel the thing inside me stirring whenever I use my abilities now. It's learning, adapting to its new prison. If scientists start probing and testing, trying to understand what I've become, it might find a way to break free. The implications of Elena's words sent a chill through Jake. He'd assumed that absorbing the alien presence had neutralized the threat. But if the creature was still active within her, still capable of evolution and escape, then the danger was far from over. There's something else, Elena continued, her voice taking on the distant quality that indicated she was accessing knowledge that came from her unwelcome passenger. The thing beneath the creek isn't the only one. I can sense others scattered across the continent, all sleeping but not dead. If this one is discovered and studied, if its nature becomes known to science, others might wake up. Jake felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as the scope of the threat became clear. They weren't dealing with an isolated incident, but with the potential awakening of multiple alien entities that had been dormant for millennia. How many others? Jake asked. Elena closed her eyes, her scarred hands pressed against her temples, as if trying to contain visions too vast and terrible to fully comprehend. Dozens, maybe hundreds. They fell like rain during the age of the Great Dying, when the giant creatures roamed the earth. Most buried themselves deep, waiting for the right conditions to emerge and feed again. Carlos crossed himself, his weathered face pale with the magnitude of what his daughter was revealing. Santa Maria, what have we gotten ourselves into? Nothing you asked for, Jake said firmly. Elena saved Thunder and potentially countless other lives by containing this thing. She's a hero, not a victim, and she deserves protection, not persecution. Elena's eyes opened, focusing on Jake with an intensity that made him feel as if she were seeing straight through to his soul. Why are you helping us? You could simply deny any involvement, let the government investigation proceed, and distance yourself from whatever consequences follow. It was a fair question, one that Jake had been asking himself repeatedly over the past few weeks. The simple answer was guilt and gratitude, but the deeper truth was more complex and harder to articulate. Because what happened in that stable changed me, Jake said finally. I saw what real courage looks like, what it means to sacrifice yourself for others without expecting anything in return. My whole life I've taken things, respect, obedience, resources, without ever giving anything meaningful back. You showed me what it means to give everything for the sake of others. Elena studied his face for a long moment before nodding slowly. And you think moving us to Colorado will solve the problem? I think it will buy us time to figure out a permanent solution. The Colorado property is remote, defensible, and far from government survey teams. It would give us space to understand what we're really dealing with and plan our next moves accordingly. Carlos had been silent during this exchange, but now he stood and walked to the edge of the garden. Looking out over the land his family had worked for 3 generations. When would we have to leave? Soon, Jake replied. Dr. Hayes expects to complete his initial survey within 2 weeks. After that, he'll file his reports, and more specialized teams will arrive. We'd need to be gone before that happens. 3 days, Elena said suddenly, her voice carrying an odd certainty. We have 3 days before the thing beneath the creek begins to stir. The government instruments are disturbing its sleep, and it's starting to respond. If we're still here when it fully awakens—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jake could see in her expression the terrible knowledge of what would happen if the alien presence broke free from its earthbound prison, while its counterpart remained trapped within Eleanor's body. "Then we leave in 2 days," Jake decided. "Carlos, make a list of everything your family absolutely cannot leave behind. I'll handle the transportation arrangements and make sure the Colorado property is prepared for your arrival." As Jake prepared to leave, Eleanor caught his arm with one of her scarred hands. The touch sent a jolt through him, not painful, but charged with energy that seemed to flow directly from the alien presence within her. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what I've become. I don't know if I can ever be normal again. The thing inside me, it's not just sleeping. It's teaching me things, showing me visions of what this world was like before humans, what it could become if these creatures ever fully awaken. Are you sure you want to tie your fate to mine?" Jake looked down at her scarred hand on his arm, at the intricate patterns that glowed faintly with their own inner light, at the shadows that swirled in the depths of her eyes. The girl he'd mocked in the street was gone forever, replaced by someone who carried both salvation and damnation within her transformed body. "I'm sure," Jake said, covering her scarred hand with his own. "Whatever you've become, whatever you're becoming, you're not facing it alone." As he rode away from the Vasquez homestead, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a mantle he'd never expected to wear. In 2 days, he would effectively become an exile from his own life, leaving behind wealth, status, and everything he'd been raised to value. But he'd also be protecting something far more precious than his own comfort. He'd be safeguarding the woman who'd shown him what true heroism looked like, and possibly preventing the awakening of horrors that could threaten all of humanity. The stakes had never been higher, and Jake had never felt more certain that he was finally doing something that truly mattered. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the Callahan ranch like a burial shroud as Jake made his final preparations for what might be the most important journey of his life. 2 freight wagons sat loaded in the main courtyard, their contents covered by heavy canvas tarps that concealed supplies, personal belongings, and equipment for establishing a new homestead in the Colorado wilderness. Marcus Webb stood beside the lead wagon, his weathered face etched with concern and confusion. The veteran foreman had served the Callahan family for over 20 years, but he'd never been asked to organize a secretive exodus in the middle of the night. "Jake, I've got to ask one more time," Marcus said, his voice low but insistent. "What's this really about?" "Your father's going to want answers when he finds out you've taken 2 of his best wagons and enough supplies to outfit a small town." Jake secured the last of his personal gear to Thunder's saddle, his movements efficient despite the weight of the decision he was making. "Tell him I've gone to Colorado to survey the mining claims. Tell him I needed to take supplies and equipment for an extended expedition. It's not entirely a lie. And the Vasquez family? How do I explain traveling with you?" "You don't explain them," Jake replied firmly. "As far as anyone knows, they left on their own accord, maybe to find work in another territory. Their business is their own." Marcus shook his head, clearly unsatisfied with the vague explanations, but loyalty to the Callahan family ran deep in his bones. "The men are starting to ask questions, Jake. Word's gotten around that something strange happened with Thunder's illness, and now you're taking mysterious midnight trips. People are going to talk." Jake swung into Thunder's saddle, the familiar weight of his Colt 45 heavy on his hip and his Winchester rifle secure in its boot. "Let them talk. By the time anyone pieces together what really happened, we'll be long gone." The sound of approaching wheels interrupted their conversation as the Vasquez family wagon emerged from the darkness. Carlos at the reins and Elena sitting beside him, wrapped in a heavy cloak that concealed her scarred arms. Their modest possessions filled the wagon bed, furniture crafted by Elena's grandfather, religious icons that had blessed 3 generations. and carefully packed seeds from the garden that had sustained them through countless seasons. Behind them rode Miguel Santana, the head stable hand who had witnessed Thunder's supernatural healing. Jake had initially planned to leave Miguel behind, but the man had approached him privately the day before, requesting to accompany the expedition. When pressed for his reasons, Miguel had simply said that he'd seen too much to pretend ignorance, and his conscience wouldn't allow him to abandon people who might need protection. Elena's transformation over the past 2 days had become even more pronounced. Her skin had taken on an almost luminescent quality in the moonlight, and the scars that decorated her arms seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm. More disturbing were the moments when her eyes would go completely black, as if something else was looking out through them, studying the world with alien intelligence. "Are you ready?" Jake asked as the wagons formed up for departure. Elena nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "The thing beneath the creek is getting stronger. I can feel it pushing against its earthen prison, trying to reach out to its companion inside me. Every hour we delay increases the risk of both entities breaking free." Carlos crossed himself at his daughter's words, but his weathered hands remained steady on the reins. The past 2 days had aged him considerably as he'd struggled to accept the supernatural reality that had engulfed his family. The convoy began moving just as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Jake had chosen their route carefully, avoiding the main roads that connected Millbrook Falls to neighboring towns. Instead, they followed cattle trails and old hunting paths that would keep them away from curious eyes and potential interference. For the first several hours, their progress was steady, but unremarkable. The wagons rolled across the familiar terrain of Jake's childhood, past landmarks that held memories of hunting expeditions, cattle drives, and lazy afternoons spent exploring the boundaries of the family property. Each mile they covered represented another step away from the life Jake had always known and toward an uncertain future. As they reached the northern edge of the Callahan Ranch, Jake called a halt near a natural spring that had provided water for travelers and wildlife for generations. The horses needed rest, and the humans needed food before tackling the more challenging terrain that lay ahead. Elena climbed down from the wagon with movements that seemed oddly fluid, as if gravity affected her differently than it had before her transformation. She approached the spring and knelt beside it, dipping her scarred hands into the clear water. "Something's wrong," she said suddenly, her voice carrying an urgency that made everyone turn toward her. "What is it?" Jake asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his rifle. Elena's eyes had gone completely black, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources. "They know we're gone. The government men have discovered that the contamination levels in Canyon Creek have changed dramatically overnight. They're sending riders to find out why." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. If Dr. Hayes had detected changes in the water chemistry, it meant the buried entity was indeed awakening, responding to the departure of its companion that Elena carried within her body. "How much time do we have?" Carlos asked, his face pale with fear. Elena remained motionless beside the spring, her black eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain entire universes of darkness. 6 hours, maybe 7. They're moving fast, and they have fresh horses. But there's something else. The thing beneath the creek isn't just awakening. It's calling to others, sending out signals that its counterpart inside me can't help but answer. Miguel crossed himself and began muttering prayers in rapid Spanish, while Marcus reached for the whiskey flask he kept in his saddlebags. "We need to move faster," Jake decided. "Carlos, can your wagon handle rougher terrain?" "It will have to," Carlos replied grimly. Jake studied the map he'd been using to navigate their route, calculating distances and travel times with the desperation of a man who understood that failure meant consequences too terrible to contemplate. "There's an old mining road about 10 miles north of here," he said. "It's steep and dangerous, but it will cut 2 days off our travel time to the Colorado border. If we push hard, We might reach it before the search parties figure out which direction we've gone." The next phase of their journey tested both equipment and endurance to their limits. The mining road Jake had remembered from his youth had deteriorated significantly over the years, with sections washed out by spring floods and rock slides blocking portions of the narrow track. The wagons creaked and groaned as they navigated switchbacks that seemed designed to test the courage of both drivers and horses. Elena's condition continued to fluctuate wildly as they climbed into the foothills. Sometimes she seemed almost normal, helping her father manage the reins or offering quiet encouragement to the struggling horses. But increasingly, she would lapse into periods where the alien presence within her seemed to take control, speaking in voices that weren't entirely her own and sharing knowledge that no human should possess. During one such episode, as they paused to rest the horses on a narrow ledge overlooking the valley below, Elena approached Jake with movements that seemed unnaturally graceful. "You should know," she said, her voice carrying the multi-tonal quality that indicated her passenger was active. That what you're doing will change you too. Proximity to one of us always leaves marks on human consciousness. The longer you stay near me, the more you'll see, the more you'll understand about the true nature of reality." Jake met her alien gaze steadily, despite the chill that ran down his spine. "What kind of marks?" "Dreams, mostly. Visions of the time before, when my kind ruled this world, and creatures like humans were nothing more than potential food sources. You'll begin to see the connections between all living things, the energy patterns that flow beneath the surface of your physical reality." Elena's scarred hand reached out to touch Jake's arm, and he felt electricity flow through him at the contact. Some humans find the knowledge liberating. Others are driven mad by it. "And which category do you think I fall into?" Jake asked. Elena's expression shifted, and for a moment it was purely human, Elena looking at him rather than the ancient entity she carried. "I think you're stronger than you know," she said softly. But strength and sanity don't always go hand in hand. As afternoon faded toward evening, their convoy reached the highest point of the mining road, a narrow pass between two towering peaks that offered a breathtaking view of the Colorado Territory spread out below them. But Jake had no time to appreciate the scenery. Smoke rising from the valley behind them indicated that their pursuers had found their trail. "They're closer than we thought," Marcus observed, studying the distant smoke through a small telescope. "Looks like at least a dozen riders, maybe more." Jake made rapid calculations based on the terrain and the capabilities of their wagons versus mounted pursuit. The numbers weren't encouraging. "We can't outrun them on this road," he concluded. "Too many switchbacks, too many places where they could set up ambushes or force us to stop." "Then what do we do?" Carlos asked, exhaustion evident in his voice after hours of fighting to control his wagon on the treacherous road. Elena had been silent during this discussion, but now she spoke with quiet certainty. "We don't run from them. We go to them." Everyone turned to stare at her, confusion evident on their faces. "I can feel the entity beneath Canyon Creek growing stronger with each mile we travel," Elena explained. "The distance between us isn't weakening the connection, it's energizing both creatures. If I go back now, while the one underground is still partially dormant, I might be able to contain it permanently." "Absolutely not," Jake said firmly. "We're not risking your life on a mite." "It's not a risk," Elena replied, her voice taking on the otherworldly harmonics that indicated her passenger was speaking. "It's an inevitability. The only question is whether I face this challenge on my terms or wait for circumstances to force my hand." Miguel had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Señorita, you cannot go back to those government men. They will want to study you, experiment on you. They will not understand what you are or what you carry." "No," Elena agreed. "They won't understand, but they will learn. And that knowledge will spread to others who might use it for purposes we can't control." Jake felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders as he realized that Elena was right. Running would only delay the inevitable confrontation, and each day that passed would make the alien entities stronger and more difficult to contain. There might be another way, he said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. What if we don't give them a chance to study you? What if we control the encounter, set the terms, and ensure that no useful information survives their investigation? Elena's eyes sharpened with interest, and Jake was relieved to see that it was purely human intelligence looking at him now. What are you proposing? Jake outlined his plan quickly, aware that time was running short and their pursuers were drawing closer with each passing minute. It was audacious, dangerous, and required perfect timing to have any chance of success. But as he spoke, Jake saw hope kindling in Elena's transformed features. For the first time since her healing of thunder, she looked like a young woman with a future rather than a vessel carrying humanity's potential doom. It could work, she said finally, but if we're going to do this, we need to do it now. While I still have enough control to ensure the outcome. As the sun touched the western horizon and painted the Colorado peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Callahan prepared to gamble everything on a plan that would either save them all or doom them to a fate worse than death. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed up from the valley below, and Jake knew their time for preparation had run out. Whatever happened next would determine not only their own fates, but potentially the future of every living creature in the territory. Elena closed her eyes and began to glow, with the same supernatural light that had filled Jake's stable on that night that now seemed a lifetime ago. The final confrontation was about to begin. The government expedition crested the ridge just as the last rays of sunlight painted the Colorado peaks in brilliant orange and gold. Dr. William Hayes rode at the head of 12 mounted men, his academic composure replaced by the grim determination of someone who had witnessed phenomena that challenged every scientific principle he'd previously accepted as fact. Behind him rode a mix of territorial marshals, geological surveyors, and what appeared to be military personnel whose presence suggested that word of the Canyon Creek anomaly had reached higher authorities than Jake had anticipated. Their horses were lathered with sweat from the hard climb, but their riders showed no signs of fatigue, only the focused intensity of hunters closing in on their quarry. Jake stepped forward from behind the cover of his wagon, his hands raised but ready to drop to his weapons if necessary. Thunder stood ground-tied nearby, the magnificent stallion's ears pricked forward as if sensing the supernatural tension that filled the mountain air. "Dr. Hayes," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin atmosphere. "I assume you're looking for answers about Canyon Creek." Hayes spurred his horse forward, stopping just outside rifle range, a precaution that suggested he understood this encounter might not proceed according to civilized conventions. "Mr. Callahan," Hayes replied, his scholarly voice tight with barely controlled excitement, "we've detected massive changes in the geological stability of the contaminated area. Something has fundamentally altered the energy patterns beneath Canyon Creek, and our instruments indicate that the source of the contamination has become dramatically more active in the past 24 hours. "And you think we're responsible for those changes?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "I think you know exactly what we're dealing with," Hayes replied. "And I think the young woman traveling with your party has abilities that could help us understand phenomena that threaten to rewrite our understanding of natural science." Elena emerged from behind her, family's wagon with movements that seemed to flow like water. The transformation that had been subtle days earlier was now impossible to ignore. Her skin seemed to emit its own faint luminescence, and the air around her shimmered with energy that made the horses nervous and sent small animals fleeing from the area. "You want to study me?" Eleanor said, her voice carrying harmonics that made several of the government men's horses shy and dance sideways. "You want to understand how I contain something that your instruments can barely detect. We want to understand how you saved potentially thousands of lives," Hayes corrected, though his eyes showed the hunger of a scientist confronted with the impossible. If you found a way to neutralize the contamination, that knowledge could be invaluable for protecting other communities. Elena's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter knowledge of someone who had paid prices beyond imagination for abilities she'd never asked to possess. Neutralized. Dr. Hayes, I haven't neutralized anything. I've simply created a different kind of prison, and the bars of that prison are carved into my own flesh and soul. To demonstrate her point, Elena pushed back the sleeves of her dress, fully exposing the intricate network of scars that covered her arms. In the fading light, the old marks glowed with steady silver radiance, while the newer ones pulsed with darker energies that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. Several of the government men gasped audibly, and Jake saw more than one hand move toward weapons before stopping, uncertain whether guns would be effective against whatever Elena had become. Each mark represents something I've absorbed, Elena continued, her voice gaining power and resonance with each word. Injuries, poisons, diseases, and now something far older and more dangerous than anything that should exist in your ordered scientific world. Dr. Hayes dismounted and approached cautiously, his scientific curiosity overriding his survival instincts. The entity beneath Canyon Creek, you took it into yourself somehow. Not all of it, Elena replied. What lies buried there is vast, ancient, beyond your comprehension. I absorbed only a fragment, a seed of its consciousness that was trying to use your horse as a host. But even that fragment carries knowledge and power that burns through human flesh and minds like acid. As if summoned by her words, the scars on Elena's arms began to glow more brightly. The newer marks, the ones she'd gained during Thunder's healing, started to move, shifting and realigning themselves into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Jake felt a familiar sensation as reality seemed to bend around Elena's transformed form. The air became thick and electric, and shadows began gathering despite the fact that the sun hadn't yet set completely. You need to leave, Jake said to Dr. Hayes, genuine concern overriding his previous antagonism. What's about to happen here isn't something you want to witness or study, but Hayes was already pulling out instruments from his saddlebags, thermometers, magnetic compasses, and devices Jake didn't recognize. The academic's eyes were bright with scientific fervor as he began taking readings from the increasingly charged atmosphere around Elena. Remarkable, Hayes breathed. The magnetic field fluctuations are off any scale I've ever seen. The temperature is dropping rapidly in a perfect sphere around her, but the humidity is increasing. It's as if she's becoming a weather system unto herself. Elena's father, Carlos, had been watching his daughter's transformation with growing alarm. Now he stepped forward, his weathered face etched with parental desperation. "Elena," he called softly, "come back to us, mija. Don't let that thing take control." Elena turned toward her father's voice, and for a moment her expression softened, showing glimpses of the young woman she had been before her supernatural burden. But then her eyes went completely black, and when she spoke, it was with a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "The time for hiding is over," the voice said through Elena's lips. "My brother beneath the stone grows restless, and our kind stir in their ancient slumber. This world will remember what it was like when we walked among you as gods rather than prisoners." The entity's words triggered a response from every sensitive creature within miles. Horses screamed and reared. Dogs howled in the distance, and birds erupted from the trees in panicked flight. The very ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with a deep, subsonic hum that seemed to resonate in their bones. Jake realized that Elena was losing her battle for control, and the alien presence within her was preparing to break free entirely. If that happened, not only would the government expedition witness phenomena that could never be explained away, but the entity might have enough power to awaken its buried counterpart and potentially others across the continent. "Elena!" Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the supernatural chaos. "Remember Thunder. Remember why you did this in the first place. The black eyes fixed on Jake, and for a terrifying moment he felt the full weight of alien intelligence studying him like a specimen under a microscope. Then something shifted, and Elena's own consciousness fought its way back to the surface. "Jake!" she gasped, her voice purely human again, but strained with the effort of maintaining control. "I can't hold it much longer. The proximity to its buried counterpart is making it stronger, and it's feeding on the fear and confusion of all these people." Dr. Hayes, oblivious to the supernatural battle raging before him, continued taking measurements and making notes. "The energy readings are stabilizing," he announced, "and whatever process is occurring seems to be reaching an equilibrium state." But Jake could see that Hayes was wrong. Elena's struggle for control was becoming more desperate with each passing moment, and the scars on her arms were beginning to crack and bleed as the entity within her pushed against its living prison. "There's only one way to end this," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible to everyone present. "I have to return to the source, to the place where this all began. The two fragments need to be reunited and contained permanently." "That's suicide," Jake protested. "If you go back to Canyon Creek now, with that thing as active as it is, if I don't go back now, both entities will break free," Elena interrupted. "And then your scientific friends will have front-row seats to the end of human dominance on this planet." The truth of her words hit Jake like a physical blow. Elena was right. There was no other choice. The alien presence within her was too powerful to contain indefinitely, and its connection to the buried entity was only growing stronger. But Jake had one more card to play, one desperate gamble that might give Elena the strength she needed to succeed. "Then you're not going alone," Jake declared, stepping to Elena's side despite the dangerous energy crackling around her transformed form. "Jake, no!" Elena protested. "The exposure will change you, possibly kill you. You don't understand what you're offering. I understand that you saved Thunder's life and possibly the lives of every creature in the territory," Jake replied firmly. "I understand that you've carried this burden alone for too long, and I understand that some things are worth dying for." Jake reached out and took Elena's scarred hand in his own, feeling the alien energy flow through him like liquid fire. The sensation was overwhelming, visions of ancient worlds, of creatures that defied human comprehension, of power that could reshape reality itself according to alien desires. But beneath the cosmic horror, Jake felt something else, Elena's own consciousness, battered and strained but still fundamentally human, still fighting to protect the world she loved despite the cost to herself. "Together," Jake said, his voice steady despite the supernatural forces flowing through his body. "We finish this together." Elena's eyes filled with tears, the first purely human emotion she displayed since the entity had begun asserting control. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Dr. Hayes and his expedition watched in stunned silence as Jake and Elena approached Thunder and Elena's family wagon. The supernatural energy surrounding them had reached levels that made their instruments useless and their horses nearly uncontrollable with fear. "Where are you going?" Hayes called out, his scientific curiosity warring with growing alarm. "To finish what we started," Jake replied without turning around. "Dr. Hayes, when you file your report, I suggest you focus on geological instabilities and contaminated groundwater. The truth would only cause panic and attract attention from forces you're not equipped to handle." As Jake helped Elena mount behind him on Thunder's back, she leaned forward to whisper in his ear, "The journey back will change you permanently. Are you prepared for that?" Jake thought of the girl who had been mocked and scorned, who had sacrificed herself to save his horse, who had taken ancient evil into her own body to protect innocent lives. He thought of the man he had been, arrogant, cruel, taking his privilege for granted, and the man he was becoming through her example. "Change isn't always a bad thing," Jake replied, spurring Thunder into motion. As they rode down the mountain trail toward Canyon Creek and whatever fate awaited them there, Jake felt Elena's scarred arms wrap around his waist, anchoring them both against the supernatural storm that was building within and around them. Behind them, Dr. Hayes and his expedition remained frozen on the ridge, their instruments registering energy patterns that would never make it into any official report. Some experiences were simply too vast and terrible for the comfortable boundaries of human science. Thunder's hooves struck sparks from the rocky trail as he carried his riders toward their destiny. The magnificent stallion seemed to understand the significance of this journey. His proud head was held high, his gait steady and sure, as if he was determined to repay the debt he owed to the woman who had saved his life. The moon rose full and bright as they descended toward Canyon Creek, its light reflecting off Elena's luminescent skin and the pulsing scars that mapped the supernatural burden she carried. With each mile they traveled, the alien presence within her grew stronger, but so did her determination to see this through to the end. Jake had begun this story as a man who measured worth by wealth and status, who used cruelty as a tool to maintain his position above others. But as Thunder carried them toward their final confrontation with forces older than human civilization, Jake understood that he was ending it as something different, a protector, a partner, and perhaps most importantly, a man who had learned what true courage looked like. The scars that Elena bore told the story of every sacrifice she'd made, every burden she'd accepted, every life she'd saved at the cost of her own humanity. But they also told another story, of love that transcended the boundaries of species and time, of the power that could be found in accepting responsibility for others' welfare, and of the strength that came from choosing hope over despair, even in the face of cosmic horror. As Canyon Creek came into view below them, its waters glowing with unnatural phosphorescence under the alien moon, Jake and Elena prepared to write the final chapter of their story. Whether it would end in triumph or tragedy remained to be seen, but it would end with two souls joined together against the darkness, facing whatever came with the courage they had learned from each other. Thunder's hooves touched the banks of Canyon Creek just as the clock struck midnight, and the ancient thing buried beneath the water began its final attempt to break free from its earthbound prison. But this time, it would not face the task alone, and neither would the scarred hands that held the power to save or damn them all. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.